Good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I am the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you so much for joining us tonight to celebrate Kelli Jo Ford's Crooked Hallelujah. Kelli Jo, thank you so much for joining us. And we are also joined by Lusy Tan, former UW Writing Fellow, who will be our moderator tonight. Thank you for joining us as well, Lusy. It is always wonderful to gather together to celebrate all things books, but I was saying actually to Lusy in the green room before, I love reading debuts, and I love it for many reasons, but one of them is, often a debut is that incredible story that someone just has to tell. And Kelli Jo, thank you so much for this beautiful book. It is really wonderful, and always also great to find new writers and new voices that we can follow for years and years. So welcome to the Wisconsin Book Festival.
Thanks so much, Connor. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. I want to take just a moment here at the beginning to say thank you to Madison Public Library and the Madison Public Library Foundation. Their unwavering support of free cultural events like this throughout the last 8 years that we've been doing the festival, but particularly these past 7 months, has been absolutely unwavering, and they have been so dedicated to making sure that we're able to bring events like this, authors like this, books like this directly to you in your home. So whether you're watching from Madison or across Wisconsin or across the nation, or even to whoever is watching us from China tonight, that is so wonderful to be able to bring it to you. I will let Lusy and Kelli get things underway, and I will see you at the end. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. All right, so should I just dive in, Lusy?
Go for it.
All right, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I thought that I would start with a quick reading, and I'm going to read just not long, just a few minutes here from the first third of the book. The book is called Crooked Hallelujah, and this story is called The Year 2003 minus 20. So it takes place in 1987. In the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. And here we meet two of our main characters, Reney and her mom, Justine, who's a young mom. And they're kind of growing up together, as you may sense from this passage. And this is about 2 pages in. A good time crew from the factory drifts in and out of the house. Sorry. I needed to set myself a timer. A good time crew from the factory drifts in and out of the house. Cigarette butts transform ashes into morning after volcanoes. Reney turns ash-dusted tabletops into canvases, tracing hearts in her path when she creeps to the kitchen in the morning quiet. Men, some with union money to spare, bring occasional gifts, a bone-handled jackknife, a book of knots, the licks of a bob-tailed dog. They fill the house with noise and a sweet-smelling smoke that Reney has come to know. They leave behind safety glasses, a stray sock here or there. One leaves the Waylon and Willie record that Reney keeps stashed beneath her bed. If being with my ex taught me anything, Justine says, it's take not 1 ounce of shit from a man. Justine, who won't call Kenny by name anymore, holds her eyeliner to the flame of a match to soften it before touching it to her eyelid. Reney leans in the doorway, waiting for the familiar sermon. You can't trust a man to take care of you. Remember that, Reney. You can't trust them at all, for that matter. They'll lie to get what they want, and they always want something. Justine steps over Reney and disappears into the kitchen. She's going to work tonight at the second job she's picked up, waiting tables at a cowboy bar. Justine walks back in with a shot glass of tequila. I wish you wouldn't go to that job, Reney says. The low-cut blouse Justine has to wear makes Reney feel equal parts angry and embarrassed. I wish Granny and Lula didn't have to walk to the laundromat, but wishing don't get that washing machine out of layaway. Justine does a little shake with her hips, holds up her tequila, and winks at Reney. Reney digs through Justine's purse and finds the lemon-shaped squeeze bottle and a disposable salt shaker. She passes the salt and squeezes a bit of lemon into her own mouth before handing it up to Justine, who has already licked the back of her hand. I go now and prepare a place for you, Justine says, before giving the salt a shake and drinking the tequila down. She cackles, then gets mock serious. Maybe, Reney isn't sure, and says, Father, forgive me. Kenny seemed good-natured enough until he didn't. After him, men ran together in Reney's mind. There could have been 1 or 10. There was the one who traveled around sharpening barber's razors and scissors and prided himself on keeping the kitchen knives sharp. There was the rodeo clown with the sweet dog and his own bag of makeup. Then there was the one whose friend owned the bar where Justine worked. The one who wore this one wore a 38 special in a holster he clipped to the inside of his cowboy boot. He had a long red ponytail and plenty of money, but no job. After Justine ended it the first time, he stood at the bottom of her bedroom window crying and strumming a guitar. The second time, he snuck into her locker at the plant and filled her purse with poison ivy. Reney doesn't know what her mom is looking for in the men or the nonstop working. She doesn't know what makes her squeeze Reney so hard and so long sometimes that it seems like all the air might leave Reney's chest for good. What makes her sit up all night watching Reney sleep some nights and stay up making noise with the good time gang others. Reney doesn't understand what makes it so hard for her mom to keep still. As far as Reney can tell, they don't need much at all, and between the one job and Granny and Lula, they have all they might ever need in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. Congratulations on this amazing debut.
Oh, thank you so much.
How are you feeling bringing it out into the world? Has it been a strange kind of, year because of promoting from doing virtual events and things like that?
I mean, it certainly has. I think that it was going to be a strange year regardless because it's my debut and I don't really know what to expect. So it's all new to me. It was going to be a strange new experience. So yes, I think that it's definitely made weirder, but I don't even understand the ways in which it has been, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely.
When did your debut come out? 2 years ago?
Mine came out in 2018. So, yeah, I mean, it was much more normal than this year has been, obviously. But I think that the whole sort of publishing landscape has really adjusted to support their authors this year, and I hope that you feel that as well. I guess it's hard to compare because this is your first book, but I definitely want to get into the way that you feel like this book has resonated against the world that we're living in now in a bit. But I also just want to start off by asking you about the history of how this book came to be. So for example, was there one thing that inspired you to write the novel? And I also love to know how long the generating process was for you, and whether this book changed at all in the making of it.
Sure, those are good questions. I think the main thing that inspired the book, and I've talked about this because it's where the book comes from, and I just can't get away from it, even if I wanted to. I grew up in a family. When I was little, I lived in a household of 4 generations of girls or women. So with my great grandmother, my grandmother, my mom, and me, and my mom's younger sister was there part of the time. Cousins in and out, and so we were just strong women, and they still are to this day. All of them are still here except for my great grandmother. And so, like, coming from that environment, I've always felt like carried by the women who raised me. And I really feel like they carried me into the writing of this book. Like I couldn't get away. I didn't set out to write this book that was inspired by my childhood, but it was just what kind of, it really, like, I am afraid that I sound too mystical because obviously there's a lot of craft and revision, all of that, but what the stories came to be were just kind of like pouring out of me. Really, from the time I first wrote my very first story in an intro to creative writing class, I was kind of writing not these stories, but these kinds of stories that come from these places. And, and I hadn't like keyed in on this specific family yet, but a family like this, it's just kind of what I went to over and over and over. It feels kind of like I didn't have a choice. And that being said, the process of, shaping this book, there were a lot of choices involved because I had been writing these stories for so long. From it, I, you know, like it had, like in terms of like, it took me over 10 years, maybe it took me 14 years. I don't really know how long it took me to write the book, because for a long time I didn't set out to write it. I was in grad school and I was just trying to write. I was really committed to the short story as a form, and I was throughout the writing, you know, until the last story was finished. But I was just writing one story after another, and it took me stepping back to realize that they were coming from the same places and the same families. Um, so you know, and then even when I realized that, it took me a long time to shape it into what became kind of a novel in stories. I didn't quite know for a long time how I would connect them or link them or where I would start, because there are stories in terms of the chronology of the family that go back much earlier, that didn't make it in the book, and then there are different stories in between that didn't make it in. So yeah, it was deciding that I was committed to, like, you know, the short story is a form always. I didn't want to make it a novel, a traditional novel. And I was also committed to a multitude of voices and interested in telling. It felt like these stories really come from these places. So I was also kind of interested in telling a story of place. So
Yeah. I want to get, I have so many questions. I want to get deeper into a lot of what you're saying.
All
The
right.
first thing I wanted to say is that I love that this is a story about 4 generations of women, and that they're living so close to each other, and their relationships to each other are so distinct, you know, from great grandmother to grandmother to great grandmother to great granddaughter, I think.
Yeah.
Each person relates to the others in really different and meaningful ways. And so I love that. And I think that you know, you saying that you have personally had that experience growing up, I saw the truth of it come out in the fiction
Yeah.
for sure. Um, I was really moved, especially by Reney's relationship with both of her grandmothers. So one is Granny, who is her grandmother by blood, and who she calls her soulmate. And then the second is Nina, who is not related to her by blood, but who is the mother of her mother's boyfriend, who maybe they get married
They
eventually,
do
or
get
partner.
married. So she becomes her
They do
step
get married.
grandmother. Yeah. But very much
Right.
her grandmother in spirit.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so they're written with such detail, and they're so different as people. And I guess I was just wondering whether, you know, these are based on real life experiences, or if these characters are totally made up in your mind, and what remained of truth was just sort of, I guess, just what you know about people.
Sure. I think of the characters as being inspired by my relationships with my grandmothers. And then the situations I put them in are made up, you know. So that's a realization I had maybe after I got divorced. Of like, or maybe before, probably the truth is, like, my soulmate was really my great grandmother. That's something that just came from me, and realizing that when I was younger. But so I was very close to my great grandmother, and you know what? She was such a special woman who I just feel like, you know, sometimes I hear like, you have more capacity, you always have more capacity to love. She had a lot of grandchildren and great grandchildren, and we probably all felt very much like we had a very special relationship with her, and we did. You know, she was really something else. And you know, and my mom and her sisters, and then we had a whole set of cousins that we all grew up like, you know, they also had very special relationships with her. And part of that is because she's such a powerful presence in our lives, but also we grew up in closeness, in close circumstances, and I think we needed one another. And she's somebody who was there for our family throughout the years, and you know, in terms of her physical presence, and in other ways too. So that very much inspired that, you know, and that was kind of how I realized early on that I would be writing about the 4 generations, because I knew that Justine was kind of my person in this book. I felt like she was who I was writing early, and I felt like I was going to keep writing about her. But I knew if I was writing about her, I would also be writing about Reney. They're inseparable. But I knew if I was writing about Reney, I would be writing about the great grandmother, because of that connection with those characters. And that's definitely inspired by where I come from, and and the way that we lived in close quarters and needed one another, and as I said, I felt carried. I just always felt protected by this powerful presence of women, and so that just kept I coming out. I think it comes out, like there's a lot of times when the characters are disagreeing or clashing, but I feel like for me there's a thread of sort of a ferocity and intention of purpose to protect one another, even as they're clashing.
Definitely. I definitely felt that.
Mhm.
And the straining that you're talking about against each other, I felt that too, when
Mhm.
Reney decides, because I think, these women are, because there are 4 generations and they're all, alive at the same time,
Mhm.
they're not that many years apart in age. So I think that there's a really interesting element of the younger generation inheriting more from that older generation, in terms of their wishes, their expectations, and because they're living in such close quarters, saying to themselves, how much of my mother do I want to
Mhm.
be part of me, and how much of it is kind of, this is irrefutably us, you know what I mean?
Right.
So then, I think when Reney goes away and goes to college and has this education, I felt not that they were, separated in the heart, but that there was this kind of big move being made,
Mhm.
this stepping away from what she knew. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. How did that feel to write, and what you think that maybe does to the dynamic of this story of these 4 generations of women?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's a that I kind of I think of Reney's departure as really kind of something that alters the universe of the book in form as well. When Reney leaves, the story changes and we get different voices that might be unexpected. And I think of that as a reflection of how Justine's world must feel when Reney has gone. Because they've been living in the same town for, Reney is in her early to mid 20s when she leaves. And so their entire lives, they've been in very close company. But they've been, I guess I'll call it on the outs. They've been on the outs for a while when Reney takes off. So she leaves without a goodbye. They're fighting essentially over a man, and they are fighting, I would imagine, what they would have spent, a lot of time disagreeing over, which is Justine seeing a better life for Reney and wanting Reney to avoid mistakes that Justine made, and Justine wanted to be her own person and make her own mistakes, and being just as bullheaded as her mother and diving headlong into it.
Right.
So when Reney leaves, I think it alters the universe of the book, and we see Justine, when we pick back up with her. She is, I'm trying to think the order when we pick back up with her. We essentially, the reader doesn't see Reney for a while after she leaves. And I talked with my agent, and my editor about whether or not we needed to see Reney, and I felt strongly that I didn't really want to see her because I felt like her departure was so big, such a big event for Justine, that it made sense for her to just be gone. And eventually we settled on hearing what she's doing. And so in one of the very next to last stories, or close to the end, we hear that they have reconnected via the telephone, and that they are, wow, I sound like I'm talking in the 1800s. They've reconnected via the telephone. But and so they are really kind of getting to know each other in this new way as adults who are talking in a way that maybe they never could because they were too close. And so I think that this distance that happens in the second half of the book is something that allows them to come back together. And then we ultimately really see the result of that in the last story, when they're, Reney comes back, and they are, I don't know, they have a moment there at the end. I keep fogging up.
Oh yeah.
I'm totally fogging up. Yeah, I've learned a lesson now. Don't run around with your daughter before you sit down for a Zoom. We were running around and doing all this stuff, and I sit down. It's like, oh wow, my glasses just keep fogging up and fogging up.
I love that you're doing that. I wish I were running around my house more these days.
Yeah, we're getting ready for a Halloween party, and so we're
Oh, that's
filling
so fun.
bags, and it's going to be just like 3 children come over in the backyard, social distance, but we can't trick or treat. So we were going to put up spooky decorations, and 3
Oh,
kids can
that's
come over in
really,
the
really
backyard.
fun. Where are you now, by the way?
I'm in Richmond, Virginia.
Okay.
Yeah. But anyway,
So
we've been
nice and
running
warm
around getting
outside
ready, and I'm just like, whew, I'm sorry, what'd you say?
It's nice and warm outside there.
It is perimenopausal here, so it's hot. But
Gotcha.
yeah.
That's okay. So, depending on how willing you are to answer personal questions, it's interesting that you have your own daughter, and I wonder if
Uh-huh.
like having a daughter um, changes the way that you went about writing this story. I guess I'm thinking a lot about like the two kinds of births. You can birth a human, and you can
Right.
birth a book, and
Mhm.
they're both extremely time intensive. I've not birthed a human, so I guess I don't
Mhm.
really know what I'm talking about. But I imagine that there are some similarities and some stark differences. And I also imagine for most writers who, especially writers who are working on their first novels, that the writing of it has taken many, many years, maybe long enough to predate your daughter. So I guess my
Mhm.
question is, has your daughter's presence in your life changed your process at all in terms of your work?
Oh my gosh, it's changed my process so much. Before I had her, there was no she. Before we had her, my writing process was to sort of catch fire and write for, I might, if I could swing it and it was a weekend, I might write for 6 hours straight, and have to be like reminded to eat, which is not something rare for me. So I just would just write in these bursts, and that is not available to me anymore. Unless there's a special situation, I'm able to get away for a quick writing retreat. I don't really do long retreats because I like my family, and we don't really live super close to family, so we don't really have help if one of us is gone. And so, try to share parenting and enjoy being with one another. So I can't, I don't do long residencies. And it's, I think that a pre-pandemic, I would maybe do my very best to get up early in the morning. And that would be my time. But really as a parent, I feel like so often if I do get up at 4:30, um, for some reason, she gets up at 5:30, and it just feels like the time is just short. But
Yeah.
people do it all the time. People absolutely do it all the time. But what I found as a parent is that for me, there is no pattern, and it's just a sort of a like grind it out whenever. And and my family, my husband and my daughter are good about understanding, like if this is a day when I just have to close the door for 8 hours because of a deadline. I don't really feel like I have those big spurts in terms of generating, but if something has to happen, it's just, can be like a weird work day on a Sunday or something. But
Right.
it's certainly changed the process of writing,
Yeah.
and changed it in other ways too.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, your novel is filled. These women's lives are sort of filled with work, especially Justine,
Yeah.
who you know, towards the end of the book is having physical issues and is relying on medication to be able to get through those long work days. And the type of work is um, new to me. I think that one thing that I really love about this book is that there's so much land in it. There's so
Mhm.
much nature. There's so much weather. There's so much dealing with the concrete. And it takes place in Oklahoma and Texas.
Mhm.
And and you mentioned before that you're writing about place, and place was a huge part of it. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. I felt like when I was writing the North Texas scenes and stories that I didn't have to. I feel like for some reason it's almost like I'm a cup of tea, and North Texas has really, I've just steeped a really long time there in terms of lived experience. And so I felt like the landscape of North Texas came really, really naturally. And I feel like characters who are working the kind of jobs that they're working so hard, so much of their lives are just our work. Whether it's a job you're getting paid for, or if you live in the country and you have horses and cattle you have to take care of and things like that, it's just work, you know. And so I really felt like that landscape, and that landscape being a part of the characters felt really natural. And again, I just felt like it just poured forth. When I was writing the Cherokee Nation stories, I felt like I had to think harder, and you know, when I go back to visit my own grandmother, like look at landscapes and think about like how, not just how I know how it looks, you can look at, you know, I remember kind of, you can look at pictures, but just how it feels to be there.
Right.
I had to be much more intentional and conscious of that. And I think you also see that, maybe I have never thought about this, but maybe you see that reflected in the characters, you know, the way that Justine kind of feels like an outsider to that place, you know, in the way that she talks about her mother always painting the hills of Sequoia County, you know, and she's saying that really as an outsider, like, I don't really know what she sees in this place. And that's not, you know, that's not my view, but I do think that she's sort of like sees her home as an outsider would a little bit now.
Yeah. I remember that. And that makes a lot of sense. In a way, Texas is the place that she decides on, right?
Yeah, it's the home that she makes. And
Right.
despite, maybe you want her to leave as you read the book. I feel like there are times that I did, you know, but it's the home she chooses again and again, you know, and it ultimately is her home.
You know, I didn't feel that way. I felt like when she was saying, I want to stay with Pitch. Pitch, for people who haven't read the book, Pitch is her mother's boyfriend, who is sort of the one who sticks around. He's the one that's closest to a father figure, you know, amid a stream of less than worthy men. He's the one that she thinks is worthy, which I love, because none of these characters are perfect, but they're all redeeming in their own ways, or most of them are, and Pitch is definitely one of them. And yeah, I think to be a girl as young as Reney is, and to say, I want to stay put, I choose him, that to me was such a strong choice. And to me, it spoke to her resilience and her independence. So I loved getting to know her in that way.
Yeah, and I hadn't really thought of that. Before I was talking about Justine when I said she chose this home again and again, but really I think initially we see when, you know, Reney says, I want to stay. And so she's choosing it, maybe not for herself, certainly not entirely, because Reney kind of says, this is what I want.
Right.
But then later, I think we do see Justine choosing it. But right, and I think that Reney makes a really mature decision in saying she wants to go back to Texas. I think. I don't know that if that would have been, maybe if her life would have been the ways that if it had been different, if they had gone home to Oklahoma.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit earlier about the form of this book and how, you know, in the beginning, it is grounded in the perspectives of these four women. And then as we move through the book, it opens up to stories that are sometimes about or told from the perspective of different members within that community, which I thought was great. And the perspective changes in terms of like a craft point of view perspective. It switches between first person and third person. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about how you made those decisions, when to use first person, when to use third person, and when to kind of branch out into a different perspective totally. Like one of my favorite characters in the book is Mose, who is this, I think teenager. How old is he?
Mose is probably in his early 20s.
Okay. Early 20s, but stunted in a way, right? Because he's
For
sort
sure.
of been protected by his mother his entire life, and then his mother dies, and he finds himself sort of adrift in the world and becomes taken in by this queer couple that moves in next door and has this like wonderful experience and relationship with them. So yeah, how did you imagine the perspective changes as you went about forming these stories into a novel?
Sure. I think that there were times when stories went back and forth from first to third and back. In particular, the second, well, I can't remember if it comes first or second, the fire story from the point of view of Justine's father-in-law. That's one that was in third at one point. But just, I felt like I think it started in first probably. And I think that is my natural inclination, is to tell first person stories. It's always where I felt more comfortable. And I remember in grad school working so hard to write in third person because it felt like a deficiency of some sort. I don't feel like that now anymore, but I remember in grad school just thinking, why do I always write in first person? It must be wrong.
You know, I'm the same way. I love first person. I feel like there's something about the idea of third person. It's like an extra layer between you and the person, which it doesn't actually have to be that way. But for whatever reason, I feels more immediate.
So in terms of just the point of view, first or third, probably a lot of these began in first, and often if I want to see just how it feels, if I'm not trusting something, I might write a whole story in a different perspective and then go back or stay. But so I think that probably there wasn't from the start a lot of conscious thought about how best to tell the story in terms of zooming out and thinking about what the book needed. I really approached each story on a story basis. I mentioned before I was always committed to the short story as a form. I really did want each chapter or story to be able to be pulled out and stand alone as a complete movement that was satisfying in some way. So really, I thought almost always first about the story needs for a short story, and then only later when I needed to, when you're standing back and you're trying to write a novel and stories or a linked collection, what I feel like it's just, what it's kind of a nebulous distinction, I don't know, but and you're thinking about where will the reader go with you and what gaps will they butt up against, and recoil against maybe. And then there were times when I needed to write a story. And so then that was really challenging because I'd never written that way, if I needed to like fill one of those spaces. But even when I did that, I was insistent that I wanted the short story to work as a short story. And then in terms of what to include, the Mose story was one of the ones that went in and out and in and out of the manuscript. And as was it's a journal entry from the grandmother's perspective called Annie Mae, a story called Annie Mae. That one went in and out and in and out of the manuscript as well. And in the end, both of those stuck. And I felt like, as I said earlier, I really did feel like, the universe of the book shifted when Reney left. And I felt like that could be an opportunity to hear from more voices of the place, as Justine is there, and she's experiencing the world anew, really, because she's been a mom since she was 15, and she's still a mom, but her daughter's gone, and they're not really close at that time. So I thought maybe it was an opportunity to explore the place a little bit, and that was just one of those place stories that I had written through the years. And so I was happy to be able to include them. And when I presented with my editor, it's kind of like a sheepish, what about this, and and I kind of made my case, and she was like, I like it, let's do it. And I really like for those characters to later see Marvy and Stevie in Justine's fire story. And so we see a little bit of completion, and despite the fact that they're characters you don't get a lot of in the book, you do catch them later and see that they're, they're thriving as much as you can when you're on the run from a wildfire.
Yeah. I mean, I love all of the ways in which the weather kind of are in these character stories of growth.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I think one of the more resonant moments was when, so Pitch, early on when Justine and Reney have moved in with him, I think a tornado is coming and he kind of just hides, he goes to the safest place, which is kind of a bunker that they have in the house, and everyone's looking for him. Nobody can find him. And then they find that he's already kind of there and has taken care of himself and left the family. And this is like one of those moments where Justine is like, have I made the right decision in in making this man part of our family when he won't take care of us? And then near the end of the book, there's a story in which there's a fire and he is still irresponsible in many ways, but he decides he's going to help fight the fire. And I thought that was a wonderful way of showing a kind of progression for that character. Even if he didn't mature in all the ways that Justine wanted him to mature, he has still changed. And even though there's a part of him that has admitted, I'm just my father's son, and there are elements of our personalities that will always be what they are, it doesn't mean that he's a static character. And I really love that.
I love hearing that. I have a soft spot for Pitch, and I've heard from different readers that there are no likable men in the book, and the men get a really kind of a rough hand here, and I feel like Pitch is not a perfect character, but I don't think any of the characters are, and something that I really like you talking about his progression, and so I guess something that I feel like I've learned as both a daughter and a mom, as I've gotten a little bit older, is that I feel like part of family life is not that we are always there for one another in our best light, and we're not our most we don't have our most heroic moments for one another, even when they're most needed. Like sometimes we really fail and we save ourselves, but I feel like part of this story for me is about the ways that we continue to fight for one another, even as we fail one another,
Yeah.
and that's not to say that that I don't know. I don't know how Justine's life would have been different if she had taken the horses and gone, right? Like maybe she would have enrolled in those classes she was thinking of, and things would have been very different. But I don't know. I sense that she made the right decision when she went back with those horses there at the end.
Yeah, the moment that I come back to is when she is delivering Pitch's fire gloves to him, and so she goes into the front cab of his truck, or his vehicle, and sees what he's taken to save from the family home, and there are all these pictures of her and her daughter. And so that was really moving to me, because even though Pitch in his actions does not perform love the way that she wants him to, it does not mean that he does not love her. And I agree with you. I think Pitch is a really, I think that he's a character that I can empathize with for sure. There are a lot of flawed men in the book, yes.
Yes,
And there also is a lot of violence. Pitch is one of the gentler ones. I don't even know if I have a question. I guess, is there anything that you want to talk about, the way that violence factors into the book at all, or into these characters' lives?
I don't know, because I think that I don't know that I was always conscious that I was telling stories that might hinge at times on a violent act. Like when I think about hybrid vigor, that's kind of the rising action is what happens with this mule. And of course, the story is also littered with violence that has occurred in the past that's mentioned as well. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know that there's anything that I want to mention. It felt true to the lived lives of these characters. It felt
Yeah.
like I felt like I was in keeping with the stories I was telling, I guess, when I was writing that violence. I mean, the entire story, the origin story for what I think of as the first story, I think of it as an origin story for Reney and Justine.
Right.
You know, the entire story is set off with an act of violence when Justine becomes a mother.
Right.
And I think of it as the origin story because it was one of the later ones that I wrote when I was trying to figure out how to
Oh,
start the book, how to tell this story about generations and place and a very specific religion and and culture. So it's one of the later ones that I wrote, and I was grasping for how to start the story. And so that's how I came to think of it as their origin story, because I think it's when both of their lives begin with each other, and that's ultimately it's a story about their lives that are intertwined with Justine and Reney.
Right. Yeah. That's really interesting that you say that was one of the later stories, because it definitely felt to me as it rang true as an origin story. The kind of violence that's like a sneaky violence. I mean, it's obviously it's a very terrible physical violence, but it's also violent every single time he runs, right? Like they live in this community where Reney can run into her unnamed father over and over, and when he sees her he runs, and that feels like, I mean, I don't know if it is a violence, but it feels that way a little bit to me, at least, even though it doesn't necessarily to her.
Yeah, I think Reney would tell us that, because she says like, we laughed, when they're like, I saw him, like it doesn't matter, but we see her again and again, like searching for something and understanding that the act of that is a violence on her mother. The just the very thought that her daughter would look for this man is understandable and also a kind of a violence, I think. Yeah, so I do think that it would be a violence on both of the main characters, despite the fact that they would say we're over this, it's not a big deal. I think there are layers where that's true, because you live long enough with something or without something, and a scar forms, I guess.
Right. Let's see what else I have here. I had a question on the tip of my tongue and it just flew out of my body. Oh, I remember what it was. So I was wondering if, you're writing this book of this novel in stories, and I was just wondering, that's a really unique form. Were there other books that inspired you to write a novel in stories?
Sure. I mean, Love Medicine is one of the first books that I remember just falling apart over as an adult. So it's a book that I probably found it in undergrad, but to me, I feel like it's the perfect form because I love the short story so much. And in the hands of Louise Erdrich, what she can do with a short story in terms of each individual story being not just, what did I say about mine? I hope it's a complete movement. It's somewhat satisfying. Like what she does with each story, which is just feels like almost any story out of Love Medicine, I think you can pull out and let it stand alone as a master short story. But then the broader, like intergenerational tale that she's able to tell with these stories, it just blows my mind. So to me, that's like the perfect book. and it's one that I definitely studied a lot. Or, often before I write, I want to just sit down, and it's funny with limited times, like, let me just read one short story, it's like, my time's up. But I might just read a story just to get a feeling, that I feel like when I write a story, I'm grasping for an emotion. There's like a tangible feeling out there, and I'm reaching for it continually. Um, and so, I mean, I went back to that one again and again. Lori Moore's The Birds of America was another book I would do that with,
Love
when
that
I'm,
book.
especially if I'm struggling with a story, just sit down in the morning before I write and read. Read one again, and that I've read a million times, just to try to, like, you know I feel like I'm chasing a feeling with an author in short fiction, and that's kind of what I love about the form. One more was Dylan Landis, called Normal People Don't Live Like This, and
Oh.
it's just a book. I don't even know where I came across it, in a bookstore at random, but it's a collection of linked stories, kind of a novel in story, but it's about a teenager and her group of friends and her family. It takes place in, like, I don't know, the Lower East Side, Manhattan, in, I can't remember the year now, maybe in the early 80s. That might be wrong. But so it's a very different setting from my book, but it's similar in the about the teenager and the family, and there are similarities. So I read both of those books, studied them, I think, was inspired by them.
That's wonderful. I always love hearing about kind of what books are in the back of your mind
Mm-hmm.
as you create your own. Um, and it's, yeah, I totally relate to that feeling of getting energized by reading
Mm-hmm.
other people's work that you admire. And it is like a distillation of a certain type of emotion that I think is so satisfying about short stories.
Mm-hmm.
And what an interesting experience that must be, to try to piece them together so that you get both that moment over and over again as you move through the stories, but also this really interesting arc.
Mm-hmm. And
Um,
just to, like, not to get like too crafty, but so Dylan Landis, I came across on the internet. She had like a blog back when we were blogging, and she I think she has talked about Love Medicine, AWP in different places. But I don't know if she had one of her talks in her blog, or she was just writing about it, but about how she studied it, and she had pictures of how she had had all these notes in the physical copy of the book. But one lesson she took away from Love Medicine, which is something I thought about so much, is put the engine of the book up front, and talking
mhm.
about the distinction between, a collection of linked stories versus a novel in stories. In some ways, I think that is a distinction that is just sort of however you feel, however you feel about the book in the day, or it's a distinction for marketing, But
Yes.
I do think when you look at a book like Love Medicine, that is a novel in stories. And there are people who pick up that book and never even think of it as short stories because it works so well as a novel. And so that's something that I thought about a lot in terms of put the engine of the book up front. What is driving the story? And that, when I think about going back and writing that first storybook of Generations, that's really what I was trying to do. How well it's carried out, I don't know, but I do think that's really what I was trying to do, is to put the engine of the book up front. What's going to be pushing the reader through these individual stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when I said it's surprising to me that you wrote that last, I think it's a
Mm-hmm.
testament to the fact that it worked, because
Yeah, thank you.
I think that in those first 50 pages, if you can, as an author, teach a reader how to read this book, then I think it sets up expectations correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, your book does that. It has these, they do work to get individually as short stories and then together as a novel. I think that it gives you a really satisfying understanding of like a specific family in a specific place.
Yeah,
um
thank you.
yeah, well, I know that we're a little tight on time now. So I want to just also say, because we didn't say this in the beginning, but for people who are watching and have a question they would like to ask, please ask it, and we will. Oh, I have just been not being responsible about questions. We have some questions.
All right, questions.
Okay, the first question is, the concept of longing for home plays an important part in this novel. Can you talk about all the things that go into our concept of home and belonging?
Wow, what an interesting question. So for me, when I think about home and belonging, I think of history, and just like, and more than like shared history. And when you leave home, you can start to form that, but you're never going to have it as long as you have it with the place and the people you come from. And there's that can be really painful and difficult, but for me, I feel like there's also great comfort in that. Like, in terms of, you think about narrative, like sharing a story. For a long time, I feel like as anyone I met or a new friend I made, I wanted to tell them my story of who I came from and where I came from. And that was that story that I was telling, even as like just like a teenager or something, was like of these women that I came from, and when you're home, you don't have to explain yourself, but in that way, because you share that story already. Yeah, so those are some of my first just sort of off the cuff thoughts of home. What do you think, Lucy?
Um, I, it's interesting. I think, going back to what you were saying about, in a way, all we can ever talk about is home, right? Everything that the stories that we tell are all grounded in a specific set of experiences. But then you also have to get distance from that in order to write about it. And when you were talking about how you had to go back home to like take notes, I felt that way too when I was writing my first novel, which was based on 2 years that I had spent in China. And China in my mind is so real and vivid to me. But the way that you explain that in stories, you need more details than just how you felt, right? So yeah, and I think actually the feeling of longing for home for me as a writer is inspiring. It makes me, it's motivating. It makes me work. I feel that I write better about a place when I'm not there, because I get to miss it, and that sort of missing distills in my mind what it is about that place that makes it so different and special.
Yeah, I thought of, that's really beautiful, and I've felt similarly, like about writing Crooked Hallelujah. I've thought of it as kind of writing my way toward home, because the small towns that I grew up in, I don't think that I will ever live in again, but they're so much a part of me, and I carry them wherever I go, and I feel a longing, and so I think that the act of writing the book was writing my way back home in a way. Even though it's fiction, the places to me that I was writing are very much real.
Yeah, and there are places that change too, right? So the way that you write about your home is going to be very different from the way someone else does about that same area, because it's your history. Home is the people that were in your life at the time and what they meant to you. So yeah, I categorize all of that under home. We have another question here. It's, did you ever think about writing, or did you ever write from Lula's perspective?
I tried to write from Lula's perspective, and I could never quite get a handle on Lula. And Lula is the character that, for the characters in the book, is also sort of, she's the most distant in terms of how other people, their ability to connect with her. And I could never quite get my Lula stories, either where she is the main point of view character in a third person story, or just a first person Lula story. I I tried. I could never quite do it.
That's, yeah, I do feel like Lula is one of the more impenetrable characters, which is not
Mm-hmm.
to say that she's less of a character. I think when
Mm-hmm.
I think of Lula, I think of so many um, images. I think of, her seizures. I think of, was it Reney who moved like her stocking so that it was covering her foot when she
Mm-hmm.
had a seizure, and her own daughter who shoved her hand in her mouth so that she wouldn't hurt herself.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much love between those three women in that moment. I felt like um, I felt the heaviness, the weightiness of her presence for sure. But I think she also always had such a strong connection with God
Mm-hmm.
that the other women probably just didn't have access to.
I think so too, and maybe that's just how I felt as the person trying to create her as a character as well. I don't know, but I did try, and they were all. I don't know that I ever got a story that felt like a complete, that I got to the end. I would write these opening scenes, middle scenes over and over, and I just couldn't figure out what they were about. Yeah, that's a good question though. I wish that I could have, whether or not they made it into the book. I wish that I could have felt like I got through to her.
Well, I mean, it was really wonderful to read. So thank you so much for writing it. And we're coming up on the hour now. I believe, did we only have an hour
I
or?
think so.
Okay. So is there anything else that you want to, I guess, say about, oh, hi, Connor.
Hi. You can ask your final question. I thought you were going to wrap up, so go right ahead.
Oh, well, no, I am. I just wanted to give her basically the last word if there's anything that she wanted to say about the book or about her experience with writing it.
I don't think I have anything else. This has been really, really a pleasure to talk to you about the book, Lucy, and the audience questions as well have just been so great. And I've really, one cool thing about the Zoom book tour is that I've gotten a chance to think about my book and talk about my book more than maybe I would have if they were having to send me to a lot of cities. And I feel like tonight I thought about the book in new and different ways, and it was really interesting. I just enjoyed it. So thank you all.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Kelli Jo, this book is fantastic. I hope that everybody clicks the green box at the bottom and buys themselves a copy. Treat yourself tonight to a great new voice, and I'm sure that we'll have the opportunity to see you in person for your next book. It is lovely to have this book in the world, and can't wait for your next one. Lucy, thank you so much for moderating tonight. We have 2 more events left in the fall celebration. So at 7 o'clock, we'll be joined by Brian Greene and Jana Levine for their books about the origins of the universe and astrophysics. And then Terry Tempest Williams at 8:30 tonight, talking about her personal essays, climate change, her experience with the world. And so thank you so much, Kelli, for taking part in this year's Wisconsin Book Festival. And we hope to see you again, and all of you at home again soon. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all so much. Good night. Bye-bye.